Great. My name's Michael Penn. I teach in the Stanford Religious Studies Department, and I want to welcome you to the third of 5 Ptarmigan mini lectures that are taking place during the first half of 21. This series showcases senior as well as exceptional junior faculty, but instead of delivering a traditional research presentation, we've asked participants to use the classroom lecture as their model, and due to Zoom fatigue, to do so in exactly 1 hour. So as a result, I will give an incredibly brief speaker introduction. Most importantly, during the presentation, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that might pop up as you're hearing the presentation. Anu Jamin, one of our department's PhD students who has overseen this series, will curate submitted questions and present them during a Q&A to our speaker. Now on to today's speaker. Dr. Yirga is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His current research focuses on how populations previously under Roman rule remembered the Roman Empire after its withdrawal. This evening, he'll be speaking to us on the topic of John of Nikiu. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Sorry. It's a whole thing. All right. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you as well to Stanford University's Department of Religious Study for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So today I hope to introduce you to an oft-cited but chronically understudied text, the late 7th century Chronicle of John, the Bishop of Nikiu in Egypt. Since I've been given a bit of space to roam as I understood it, sorry, Michael, if that's not the case, I will take the study will take the form of a kind of a biography of the author, but also a bit of a biography of the text and its translations into Arabic and Ge'ez, or classical Ethiopic. After this, I will discuss, to the extent possible, that is, John's audience in Egypt. Finally, and this will form the centerpiece of the talk, I want to take a look at one episode in the Chronicle, which is the Bishop of Nikiu's account of the reign of Diocletian. What I hope to reveal is an author caught in an odd chronological and cultural space, between a world that is still recognizably Roman, but undoubtedly beginning to change into one in which he and his colleagues were marginal, both politically and culturally. I hope to share with you at least part of a story about the day after empire, a post-Roman world. The Chronicle is a world history, and by this I don't mean an actual world history, but a history of the Mediterranean, beginning with Adam and Eve and ending with the Arab conquest of Egypt by Amr ibn al-As in 642 CE. Focusing in particular on the history of the Byzantine Empire and its Christian population. It was originally composed in Coptic, the indigenous language of Egypt and the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, which was written using a modified form of the Greek alphabet. This language had existed and developed alongside Greek in Egypt, among both the educated elite in major cities, and especially among Egyptians in smaller towns and monasteries, all the way into Upper Egypt. Eventually, the Coptic language became the dominant liturgical language of the Miaphysite Church, and the language of most of the citizenry, particularly those in the countryside. I should note that the claim that the Chronicle was written in Coptic is disputed by some. Some have suggested that the Chronicle was originally composed in Greek, and in some sense this is true. John appears to have predominantly made use of Greek texts as his sources, and in some instances appears to have been the first translator of these texts into Coptic. What little we know of we know little of John's ecclesiastical career and almost nothing about his early life. He was likely born after Byzantine rule in Egypt had ended in 642, and he appears to have received an education in Greek and was familiar with a monastic life, likely being a monk himself. His education suggests that he came from a fairly wealthy family, but we have no other evidence for his socioeconomic background. John eventually became the bishop of the important see of Nikiu in the late 7th century, and he is listed among the bishops present with the Coptic bishop John III at his deathbed in 689 CE. He is mentioned once among an assembly which sought to elect John III's successor. This assembly, which included a large group of bishops, clergy, and laity, apparently attempted to secure the election of a deacon named George from the town of Sakha to the patriarchy without the knowledge of Egypt's governor. Our sources disagree on the presence of John of Nikiu at the selection, however. While the Archdeacon George, the author of the History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, places John squarely in the inner circle of influential bishops present at the death of John III and the selection of Isaac I. Mina of Nikiu, John's successor, claims that John was present in Alexandria only for the enthronement of Isaac, acting as a representative of all the bishops of Upper Egypt. Mena, who later describes John as a man wholly accomplished in the wisdom of God and men, may have wanted to minimize the role of his predecessor in a conspiracy to enthrone George of Saka against John III's dying wish, while the Archdeacon George might have sought to implicate John of Nikiu, among others. The paucity of sources surrounding this vital period leaves room for little more than speculation, however. We do know that John maintained his position as Bishop of Nikiu through the reign of Isaac I, John III's choicest successor. And when Isaac died in 692 CE, or some 2 or 3 years after taking the throne, he was succeeded by Simeon I, who was a Syrian. It is during Simeon's reign that John's career reached both its zenith and nadir. Shortly after surviving an attempted assassination by poisoning, Simeon made John the Mudabbir, or administrator, of all of the monasteries of Egypt. It is unclear what exactly this position might have entailed, but as important as his appointment as Mudabbir may have represented a significant promotion for John. While he had previously acted as a kind of representative of the bishops of Upper Egypt in one instance, he was now given some degree of control over all of Egypt's monastic communities, a significant upgrade not only in terms of geographic scope, but also influence. Egypt's monasteries had served as the home of several notable anti-Chalcedonian bishops, many of whom had been recruited from these monasteries by the Patriarch Peter IV, who reigned from 577 to 606, to compete with the rapidly ballooning ranks of Egyptian bishops who had allied themselves with the Chalcedonian Patriarchate. What is more, many of these monasteries functioned as parish churches, which were used by local communities. This meant that John's position kept him in the front lines of the doctrinal disputes that characterized the landscape of early Islamic Egypt. And I've borrowed a table from Stephen Davis here to illustrate how complicated the claims to being the true representative of all Christians in Egypt had become by the time the Arabs arrived. In a land where doctrinal allegiance, even within monastic communities, was far from static, John's oversight of the monasteries, particularly in a period in which many of the monasteries were being rebuilt, made him an important leader in the battle on the ground for Christian Egypt's soul. At some point before the end of Simeon's reign, John's career as Mudabbir and bishop was cut short. John's contemporary, the Archdeacon George, reports that shortly after taking up his position, John was removed from it. Under his watch, a group of monks had kidnapped a woman in Wadi Habib and sexually assaulted her. Word quickly spread and John was forced to act. He elected to have the ringleader of the group beaten. And this was done so brutally that the monk died of his wounds a few days later. The brutality of the beating apparently did not sit well with a number of the bishops of Egypt, who assembled a secret meeting and summoned John to explain himself. This assembly decided to reduce him to the rank of a mere monk. It is not entirely clear what George means by saying that the meeting was conducted in secret, but given that the final word on John's fate was delivered by the bishops collectively, this may have meant that the punishment was delivered without the knowledge of the patriarch, lower clergymen, or lay population. John's successor, Mina, did not view him as particularly objectionable, given his favorable cameo in the life of Isaac of Alexandria, but John's life and works otherwise seem to have disappeared from the written records of the church. His summary deposition by the bishops also reveals the great degree of common power that the bishops were apparently capable of exercising independent of their Syrian patriarch. Not only were they able to depose John, but they were also able to appoint another man to his position without protest from Simeon. This story is preceded by an account which emphasizes the unpopularity of the patriarch among both the people of Alexandria and its leading clergy. The patriarch's sensitive position and the relative unity of the Egyptian bishops below him may indicate that John had simply found himself on the wrong side of a poorly recorded power struggle within the ranks of the anti-Chalcedonian episcopate. The chronicle was likely written at some point in his bishopric, but it's impossible to know exactly when, and the text remained very obscure afterwards. No Coptic or Arabic manuscripts or fragments of the text have survived, and John himself does not appear in the papyrological record. To further complicate matters, there is evidence that John apparently edited the chronicle at least once, and that the work of editing was left incomplete. Philip Booth noted that the synopses available in the table of contents sometimes, and I quote here, refer to episodes absent from the main text. This suggests, therefore, that while the coverage of the rubrics was far from perfect, they nevertheless represent an earlier version of the chronicle. While it is unclear whether John or another editor was responsible for this discrepancy, it nevertheless suggests that before the text was translated into Ge'ez, and possibly before it was translated into Arabic, some episodes were removed, and we can presume some were inserted. We can say with certainty that the text was selected for translation, and likely abbreviation, by a Copto-Arabic author. The date of this Arabic translation is unknown, and no Arabic copies of the chronicle have survived. This murky process of transmission and abbreviation significantly changed the text, and it is unclear what was removed in the process of abbreviation. The text did not seem to enjoy much popularity among a later generation of Copts eager to demonstrate some bonds of solidarity between themselves and their Muslim hegemons. But the hostility of the final chapter towards the Arab invaders might be appropriate to the Bahri Mamluk period, when tension in relations between Copts and Muslims eventually turned into mob violence against the Christian community in the early 14th century. And as a result, one might speculate that the text might have seen new popularity among Copts in this period. Sergei Frantsuzov suggests that the text was translated and abbreviated in the 13th century on the basis of the use of a term for salary dating from the early Mamluk period, although this can only truly provide a terminus post quem. No extant texts demonstrate a tacit or explicit awareness of the chronicle in medieval Egypt. The abbreviated history would pass into obscurity once more until its arrival in late 16th century Ethiopia. It was brought to the country in the hands of an Egyptian deacon named Gabriel, and was translated into classical Ethiopic or Ge'ez with the assistance of an Ethiopian cleric named Mihirka Dingid, a historian in his own right, who was responsible for the later composition of the first 23 chapters of the Royal Chronicle of King Susnios in the mid-17th century. And I want to add a brief note on Ge'ez as well. Ge'ez is a Semitic language spoken in the Horn of Africa, which first appeared in royal inscriptions in the late antique kingdom of Aksum in the 3rd century CE. Its alphabet is a version of epigraphic South Arabian, which was modified in the Aksumite period to indicate vowel sounds. Ge'ez was the primary written language of modern Ethiopia, modern northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, and remains in use in ecclesiastical contexts to this day. John's Chronicle was by no means Ethiopia's first introduction to the chronicle as a genre of historical writing. Indeed, by the time Gabriel and Mihirka Dingil sat down to translate John of Nikiu's work, Ethiopians in the court of Solomonid kings were already deeply enmeshed in a 300-year-old tradition of historical writing. These texts were primarily royal chronicles, which were dictated by the Solomonid king to royal officials known as the scribe of commands, or Tzahafa Te'izazat. In fact, the chronicle was not even the first world history to be imported from Egypt. At some point between 1496 and 1540, the world history of the 13th century George al-Makin was translated from Arabic into Ge'ez and was particularly prized for its detailed history of early Islam. Unfortunately, I will not have time here to discuss here the history of the Chronicle of John of Nikiu in Ethiopia, but I can happily answer questions about this during the Q&A, because I think it's a really sort of fascinating history. As for John's audience, because of a lack of direct citation or preservation of this text, it's difficult to determine who exactly John of Nikiu's audience was or how his text was received by his contemporaries. But there are some things we can infer about his audience's interests and education. John's Egypt was one in which Greek was a prestige language with widespread use, while a majority of the population spoke Coptic. Greek was a language of administration and some ecclesiastical ritual, and bilingualism was common. But the production of historical texts, at least as we understand them, in this language is rare, and the Chronicle is the only known Coptic text that was not explicitly an ecclesiastical history. It would not be until the 10th century that any such Egyptian work of history would appear again, and that in Arabic. And yet John seemed to presume his Coptic audience would have access to Greek historical texts and the ability to read them. For example, he asks his readers to consult Byzantine authors such as Procopius and Agathias for further insights on the reign of Justinian and his Italian campaigns, providing no further comments of his own. He made use of several notable Byzantine historians, including the 4th century Eusebius, the 6th century John Malalas. John of Nikiu also apparently shared sources with the 7th century historian Theophylact of Simocata, and perhaps had access to his work on the reign of the Emperor Mauricius. While we have no record of anyone who might have read this work, we might imagine that the Bishop of Nikiu's audience was much like him, bilingual, capable of engaging with Roman historians writing in Greek, but electing to write in a language that was particular to their location. In this sense, John and his audience were typically Byzantine, if we are willing to engage with the idea of a Byzantium whose cultural horizons do not begin and end in Constantinople. But to be so some 2 to 3 generations after the Arab conquests points, I think, to an interesting example of continuity. In many ways, the education of John and his audience of educated Egyptian elite was a product of political necessity as much as cultural habit and social expectation. Both his ecclesiastical and secular education was in many ways designed to integrate him into an aristocracy that would, in its administrative work and intellectual endeavors, reproduce Byzantine hegemony in Egypt through the maintenance of particular cultural and political institutions. What makes John and his first audiences unique is that they are among the first generations trained to reproduce a hegemony that no longer existed in practical terms. As a final note, I just wanted to tack this on, that John is particularly interested in monastic affairs, and we must presume his audience, if not monks, were equally interested in tales of ascetic heroism. John explicitly tells us in his incipit that his history is designed to be instructive for those he calls the lovers of toil, and even where monasticism and asceticism seem least likely to be relevant to the issues at hand, they rear their heads, as we shall see in our discussion of Diocletian, which follows. So with this in mind, I wanted to jump into an analysis of one exemplary passage in the Chronicle. Modern scholars have frequently used John of Nikiu's text as part of larger arguments suggesting that by the time Amr ibn al-As wrested Egypt from Byzantine control in 642, the creation of a Christian Egyptian or Coptic identity as something separate from Roman identity was already well underway. Some have even described John's universal history as a text that was not just parochial in its outlook, but indicative of a burgeoning Coptic proto-nationalism. It is evident to me that this is absolutely not the case, and that John of Nikiu appears to be quite keen to situate Egypt's history into a wider history of a Christian Roman Empire. In order to illustrate this, I will focus on John of Nikiu's account of the Great Persecution by Diocletian, which began in the first years of the 4th century CE. And I want to make the argument today that this passage does not reflect the beginning of a Coptic identity, which was completely divorced from its Byzantine context, but that in a recognizable way, this was a Byzantine text. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Emperor Diocletian, at the head of a new government in the Roman Empire, embarked on a campaign of book burnings, property confiscations, and public executions targeting Christians in the Roman Empire, which would last until at least 313 CE. The memory of these persecutions had a particularly profound impact on the Egyptian church. Indeed, so many were killed in Alexandria and Egypt that the church would later come to take the beginning of Diocletian's reign in 284 CE as the beginning of a new calendrical system known as the Era of Martyrs or the Era of Diocletian. A cult of martyrs would develop from this persecution, with several cult sites scattered throughout the region. John's account of Diocletian is unique in Byzantine and Christian historiography. John does not begin by mentioning Diocletian's ethnic birthplace or ethnic background, instead immediately and incorrectly identifying him as Egyptian. He comes to power with the aid of the army and with the assistance of demons, to whom he and his colleagues regularly made both animal and human sacrifices. The people of Egypt and Alexandria then responded to the rise of Diocletian and his colleagues in the Tetrarchy by refusing to submit to them. Diocletian in turn mustered an army and managed to break the city after a long siege, burning it to the ground and establishing his authority over it. What follows is a lengthy description of the murder of Christian men, women, and children across the empire. John writes that it was a persecution of all Christians, extending over 19 years, beginning with the time of his accession to power and his conquest of the land of Egypt. The bloodletting reaches its climax with the murder of all the Orthodox bishops of Egypt and the Patriarch of Alexandria, Peter. Diocletian is eventually destroyed by an act of God, as are most of the enemies of the faithful depicted in the Chronicle. A full 22 years after his reign began, Diocletian loses his mind as the result of a bodily disease, and this is sort of left vague by John of Nikiu. We learn later that in addition to the corrupting influence of the demons that he worshipped, that the other senior emperor, Maximianus, had been casting spells on his unsuspecting colleague. The Senate sends him to exile, where a life of solitude, interrupted only by the Christians who supply him daily with food, brings him back to his senses. So once again, the asceticism sort of rears its head in John's text. We find Diocletian practicing some sort of, for lack of a better word, a secular asceticism, and it heals him. When he attempts to return to Rome and have the army, urban magistrates, and Senate declare him emperor again, they refuse, claiming that he'd gone mad. This drives Diocletian to a second mental collapse that ultimately leads to his blindness and death. So, John of Nikiu's account of the Diocletianic persecutions is informed in part by an account of Diocletian's siege of Alexandria in the Chronographia of John Malalas. It is a unique account of a widely attested rebellion by Lucius Domitius Domitianus, the governor of Egypt from 297 to 298 CE. While Malalas never mentions Domitianus by name, this must be the affair that he's referring to, as there were no other military actions in Egypt until well after the reign of Diocletian had ended. Malalas reports that Diocletian mustered an army in response to a rebellion by the Egyptians who had killed their governor. For this crime, Diocletian besieged Alexandria, destroying the aqueduct leading into the city, and finally burning it to the ground. He then let his soldiers kill the city's inhabitants until, and I quote here, the blood of the slain had come up to the knees of the horse on which he was mounted. Malalas then claims that upon entering the city, Diocletian's horse slipped on a corpse and stained its knees with blood, cutting the killing short. The Alexandrians erected a statue of the horse as an offering of thanks to God, who, according to Malalas, caused the horse to stumble. Malalas erroneously identifies this as the first year of the calendar of Egyptian Alexandria, presumably referring to the era of martyrs calendar. I should note as well that Diocletian did have a statue built apparently commemorating his victory over Domitianus, and this is the Pillar of Pompey. Malalas may simply have been recounting a legend about an equestrian statue on the pillar. So two aspects of this account are odd, I think, considering what we know about Diocletian's siege of Alexandria. First, Malalas depicted Domitianus's rebellion as a popular rebellion of the citizens against their governor. He places the blame for disobedience not just on the citizens of Alexandria, against whom the attack was directed, but against the Egyptians collectively, and depicts the whole affair as something akin to a provincial flare-up, with disastrous consequences for the indigenous population. But Domitianus himself was the governor of Egypt, and his rebellion was an attempted coup. Numismatic evidence from the very brief reign of Domitianus seems to confirm this. He refers to himself in coinage as Imperator and Augustus, and much of the first coinage minted in his reign makes explicit reference to his attempt to control the entire empire. The slogan found on the reverse of his first series of silver coinage reads Genio Populi Romani, dedicating the coinage to the genius of the Roman populace. Second, Malalas's association with the beginning of the Alexandrian era of martyrs with the rebellion of Domitianus is peculiar. Again, the Alexandrian calendar system begins with Diocletian's accession in 284 CE, and is first attested towards the end of the 4th century. Malalas, a Syrian from Antioch, would likely have been familiar with Diocletian's persecutions, and particularly its impact on Alexandria's Christian community. The only other alternative is that he must have believed that the uprising did in fact occur far earlier than it actually had. John's account of Diocletian does draw key facts from Malalas's account of the siege of Alexandria, though it differs significantly in tone and detail from Malalas's account. John's account describes the siege of Alexandria in the vein of Malalas, describing the siege as occurring in the first year of Diocletian's reign. But it seems to indicate that John may have followed Malalas in conflating the Christian persecution and Domitianus's uprising in terms of dating. But John's account is ultimately starkly different from that of Malalas. While what survives of Malalas does not mention Diocletian's actual Balkan birthplace or ethnic background, John identifies him as Egyptian. He also depicts Diocletian's actual retirement to his palace in the Balkans as a forced exile to an island named Waros in the west, with which we are not familiar. John also has him attempt to return to power, gesturing at Diocletian's actual brief return from retirement. Malalas, however, simply has Diocletian retire after overseeing games at Antioch. This is a product of the second set of sources upon which John seems to rely, namely Coptic martyrologies concerning the great persecutions of Diocletian. John of Nikiu's account of Diocletian bears many features of a group of Coptic hagiographic cycles based on what Arieta Papa Constantinou identified as the Antioch legend, or what Tito Orlandi referred to as the ancient Antiochian cycle. These passions deal with the same character or collection of characters who undergo martyrdom at the hands of Diocletian's court, which is placed in Antioch. In these texts, the protagonist and main antagonist are connected to each other through bonds of friendship or blood relation. In these texts, Diocletian is identified as a Christian shepherd named Agrippida, who lived in Egypt alongside several other hagiographic stars of the Diocletianic persecution in Egypt, such as Pasota of Pachoy, Theodore the General, and Basilides. Diocletian becomes a soldier, and after falling in love with the daughter of the Roman emperor at court in Antioch, he eventually becomes emperor himself. As the narrative progresses in its various forms, Diocletian comes to mistrust his Christian advisors, who are returned to Egypt and subsequently tried and killed by the local governor. Tito Orlandi was the first to make a serious attempt at ordering and dating the appearance of these cycles, naming them after the primary martyrs in each collection of related texts. Excuse me. He suggested that the earliest hagiographies of this type were produced soon after the Council of Chalcedon, modeled on the epic passions which had been produced by earlier Greek hagiographic schools. In ordering the cycles, he noted that it was not until the emergence of the Basilides cycle, in the final stage of the development of the Antioch legend tradition, that Diocletian was identified as Agrippida the Egyptian. The Basilides cycle itself was derived from the earlier cycle of the Theodores, a collection of 6th and 7th century hagiographies that revolved around the martyrdoms of Theodore the Anatolian and Theodore the General. Arieta Papa Constantinou was the first to argue for a post-Arab conquest date of composition for the earliest hagiographies in the Basilides cycle. She argued that the absence of the Roman government in the 7th century, and with it the end of Chalcedonian political support in the region, spurred the creation of this cycle, which sought to forge a new Christian identity through the appropriation and indigenization of both the first victims of Diocletian's persecutions and Diocletian himself. This is done in order to demonstrate the institutional continuity of the anti-Chalcedonian church as the heir of the church that Diocletian persecuted. Evidence of John's use of the Basilides cycle appears not merely in his use of an Egyptian origin for Diocletian. And here's a point where I sort of want to take issue with the imprecise modern translations through which most scholars approach the chronicle. The Ge'ez text does not use a word that corresponds to R.H. Charles's impious, as he has it, or Zotenberg's Empire when describing Diocletian, a translation which suggests, to my mind at least, a sort of irreverence within an established framework. The word used by the Ge'ez translator is manafik, meaning a secessionist or schismatic, from the root verb nafaga, meaning to tear off, tear away, rend, or divide, i.e. to create a schism or violently separate. The distinction is important here, I think, because it suggests, in accordance with the Coptic text of the Basilides cycle, that Diocletian was not depicted as a persecutor to whom Christianity was alien, but that he had acted as a vengeful apostate. Oops, sorry. Let's see here. Here we are. Charles's translation muddles this important detail, which suggests, along with Diocletian's Egyptian origin, that John drew extensively from his indigenous hagiographic tradition in constructing his account. Now, the question I wanted to get at was whether this could possibly reflect the thought world of a bishop with a Byzantine education. And at this point, it seems relatively easy to point to John of Nikiu's adoption and revision of elements of the Antioch legend as evidence of his attempt to ensure that the thread of narration does not leave Egypt. Antioch, where Diocletian got his start in imperial government according to the hagiographies, is struck from the chronicle completely. The details of Diocletian's military career are also completely removed. But there are very good reasons, I think, to read this within the framework of a history of a Christian Roman Empire. First, the integration of the Antioch legend with the account of the Alexandrian uprising pulled from the Chronographia of Malalas ultimately produced a totally unique addition to the legend. No other texts in the Antioch legend treat the victims of persecution as anything other than hapless victims. Second, John takes pains to note that the killings happened all over the empire and not just in Egypt. Conversely, the Antioch legend goes out of its way to present Egypt as the center as the very center of persecution. One consistent pattern of the one consistent pattern, I'm terribly sorry, my sort of reading of them sort of acting up here. Consistent pattern of the hagiographies which make up the text of the legend is that no matter where the martyr is, when he's sentenced to death, the actual execution is always carried out in Egypt by an Egyptian governor. Emphasizing the pan-imperial nature of the persecutions in the chronicle had the effect of Romanizing the account by highlighting the collective suffering of all of the empire's Christians. Rather than centering the narrative on Egypt, John simply positioned the province and its capital as a bastion of Christian Roman resistance. So I think here, one more reading of the Ge'ez will better serve to illustrate John's interest in Egypt as a province rather than a sort of proto-nation. As mentioned above, while Malalas claimed that Diocletian came to Egypt to exact revenge on a wayward indigenous population that had killed their governor, John of Nikiu's description does not mention the killing of any government officials. Instead, he states that the city collectively refused to submit to Diocletian's authority because he was lawless. Charles's translation of John's description describes Diocletian as the most wicked of all men, which appears in the text as وَأَمَّتْسِي زَيَأَبِّئِمْ كُلُّ أَمَاتِيَان. So the key word there for wicked is ammatsi. Now, August Dillman, focusing primarily on biblical correspondences, notes that ammatsi in the Ge'ez Bible, which he translated as injustus, iniquus, or improbus, was often used to translate the Greek word adikon in 9 instances, paranomos in 5 instances, anomos in 4 instances, with asebis and ubristis each accounting for 1 instance of the word in Ge'ez. This might seem at first to be an odd approach to the problem of unearthing the meaning of a passage that was first written in Coptic and translated from Arabic. But I think this works because the Ge'ez Bible upon which Dillman based his own work was a translation produced from a Coptic Arabic Bible in the 14th century, itself based on a Coptic New Testament. So it's following essentially the same path of translation that the Chronicle followed. Furthermore, the Coptic language frequently makes use of Greek terminology, and adikos, paranomia, and anomos are frequently attested in Coptic with the same meaning of unrighteousness or unjustness for adikos, and lawlessness or wickedness for paranomos or anomos. In short, the most important feature of this word seems to stem from some notion of the violation of a law, be it man-made, divine, or natural. Diocletian is not just evil in the same way that demons or pagan idolaters are wicked. The Ge'ez word implies that he violates legal norms in some way. So I have him here translated as the most lawless of all men. But why would John describe him this way? In the preceding sentence, John accuses Diocletian of taking power and securing the support of the army, despite not only mentioning the existence of a civil apparatus consisting of senators and magistrates. Furthermore, he also notes that it was a senatorial decree that exiled him to Waros in the first place, and the army, in addition to the Senate and other urban magistrates, reject his appeal to return to his previous position. But John was most likely not referring to the usurpation of power with the assistance of the army. And indeed, this would be an odd criticism, as both John of Nikiu and his sources seem to understand that extra-legal action was a normal part of changes of leadership and could often have good outcomes. I think the most notable example of this is John of Nikiu's use of a Constantinopolitan source that praises Heraclius's uprising against the Emperor Phocas. It was not his seizure of power using the army per se that made him lawless, but his willingness to immediately turn his newfound authority against the common good of the citizenry. His unjust behavior, really his tyrannical behavior, is his willingness to use the state to abuse innocent citizens. Again, there is no mention of Domitianus, nor are we told, as in Malalas, that the Egyptians had killed their governors. The citizens of Alexandria and Egypt must then be understood as citizens resisting tyranny in John's imagination. So to conclude, I think John appears to have universalized the Egyptian hagiographic narrative of the Tetrarchic persecutions and under the reign of Diocletian. This is not an indigenization, I think, of a Roman history in the service of the formation of a new Egyptian Christian identity, nor is it a haphazard combination of 2 different source traditions of the same event. Rather, John's careful construction of this historical event through a combination of history and historiography is best understood as the adaptation of indigenous hagiographic facts into an account of a formative event in the history of Mediterranean Christianity. This was then applied to a framework with cultural cachet among its audience, that is the pan-Mediterranean genre of the historical chronicle. This cannot be understood as the work of a parochial text with narrow local concerns. Egypt and Alexandria are instead depicted as the locus of a traditionally Roman resistance to tyrannical government, and as places where Christianity's greatest foe and first martyrs first appeared. John's truly novel act of composition, then, is to conflate the two resistances, one Christian and one, I guess, Republican, for lack of a better word, by borrowing from Malalas's confusion without acknowledging it as such. I suggest that this conflation is intentional, and that John's unique contribution is to suggest that resistance to tyranny and resistance to dogmatic compromise are one and the same struggle. John then must be understood as something more than a Coptic proto-nationalist. He presents Alexandrians under siege not as vulnerable apolitical Christian martyrs, but as Romans resisting an unjust, un-Roman government, and unjust and un-Roman not just because it seized power with the aid of the army, but because this extra legal seizure was done with the intent of upsetting the peace of the entire state. So I've run a little short, but I want to thank you all for your time. I tried to keep it to a tight 40. I ended up at around 37. And so I hope that someone in the question and answers can ask me about the Ethiopian life of the Chronicle, which I think is an absolutely fascinating story in and of itself about what happens to late antique texts in medieval and early modern Ethiopia. I sort of left it out in part for time and in part because I felt it wasn't entirely appropriate to the series. So I guess not to force questions on the audience, but well, at any rate, thank you very much.
On behalf of everyone, I'm going to give you a nice round of applause. Congratulations. That was an amazing talk, super well researched. So, and just so everyone knows, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A and I'll be getting to them. But I think we should start off with a question. Could you tell me about the Ethiopian life?
Thank you, Anuj. You're too kind. I like this because I like to frame it as a sort of biography of the text rather than of the author. So when it reaches Ethiopia, it's in the context of an ongoing sort of conflict between the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and a sort of rising Catholic Church that is finding new converts as a result of interactions with the Jesuit mission from among the Portuguese. And it's ultimately, I think, the Catholics are ultimately very successful in gaining a number of converts in northern Ethiopia. And so it produces a lot of anxiety, especially among churchmen. So the people who commissioned this translation were actually a general known as Ras Athanasios or Athanasius, and the Queen Regent of Ethiopia at the time, Mariam Senna. And I think the idea there is that this is meant to be sort of instructive to the young king. So it's meant to be a sort of mirror of princes. You're meant to study the sort of successes and failures of various Roman emperors. And then after that, you're supposed to see as well what the adaptation of a sort of Chalcedonian Christianity does to the health of the state. So like immediately after Chalcedon in John of Nikiu's text, you start to see a sort of breakdown of the sort of good functioning of the state. And I think what's particularly important about this is this sort of ultimately culminates in the collapse of Roman hegemony in Egypt. This is sort of its utility, I think, at least to the end of the 17th century when the influence of Catholicism finally sort of dies down. After this, the text gets a new life, and in this new sort of second life, it's used as a source in particular for the composition of indigenous lives of John Chrysostom. So Ethiopia actually develops its own sort of tradition of writing a life of John of Chrysostom. Witold Witekowski writes about this for quite some time. And so John of Nikiu is used there. But eventually people stop using it towards that end as well. The popularity of the life of John Chrysostom sort of dies out. Finally, what happens is people begin to associate the manuscripts in which the text is bound with the Kabra Nagas. So very often, the chronicle appears, right, in collections of other texts, right? So you have like a history of Secundus, sort of lives of Alexander, but the Kabra Nagas, which is sort of the national epic of Ethiopia, written in, or the Solomonid Kings, written in the 14th century or perhaps the 13th century, is really viewed as the most important text. And eventually, people simply stop caring about the other texts that are bundled in with the Kabra Nagas. And what becomes important is the Kabra Nagas itself. So much so that, so in 1868, a British expedition kills an Ethiopian king and takes his library and sort of auctions parts of it off. One of the manuscripts that was taken was a manuscript that contained the Kabra Nagas. The king that reigns after this king who was killed, Johannes IV, actually writes to Queen Victoria and sort of tells her, listen, you know, one of your citizens has a manuscript called the Kabra Nagas. This is very important to me. I actually need this because you know, without this, the people in my country won't listen to me anymore. And he seems to understand it, the Kabra Nagas, and it isn't this, by the way, but he understands it as a text that contains the laws of his country and the names of all the provinces of his country. So the manuscript is ultimately returned to him, and apparently Johannes, even though he either couldn't or didn't read it, would carry this text with him everywhere as a kind of totem. And apparently, even when he was killed in battle against the Sudanese Mahdists, he had this book with him at his death. And so I like the idea that the text goes from this sort of instructive mirror of princes in the early 17th century to finally in the late 19th century, just being lost entirely in the mythology of this manuscript, which in its entirety is understood as the Kabra Nagas, or the Glory of Kings. And even that eventually isn't read. It just becomes this sort of totem that the king carries around. So sorry, that was the bit of the history I wanted to share. I hope I didn't take up too much time.
No. This is exactly what this time is for. So I'm actually going to kind of turn our attention more to John. And I really wanted to return to this idea of his early education. And you mentioned that it was both ecclesiastical and secular. Could you just tell us a little bit more about, you know, what that might have entailed?
Sure. So to my mind, this might have entailed both the sort of training that might have made him familiar with the sort of rigors of a monastic life and what was expected of them in this instance, but also some sense of a familiarity both with theological texts and the variety of secular historical texts that he apparently had at his disposal. So to my mind, this might be the sort of training in the study of rhetoric and philosophy, etc., that you might find in the late antique period more generally. And he seems comfortable and familiar again with even classicizing authors like Procopius and Agathias.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna take a question from an audience member here. How do the persecutions that John describes shape the ancient historical material that he writes about, the beginning of the world, etc.?
Let's see. So the trick with the chronicle, I think, is that each chapter, in a sense, is kind of treated as a discrete sort of episode. So after Diocletian and the Tetrarch, I mean, the last mention we get of the persecutions really is a bit immediately after the life of Diocletian, which mentions that Maximianus had been casting spells on Diocletian. And this is sort of the last time Diocletian is really mentioned after that. And in fact, it's weird. The era of martyrs dating system is actually only mentioned, I think, once after that. So every once in a while, John will break the narrative by saying, you know, and this happened in the year of so-and-so. But the era of martyrs dating system is only actually used once thereafter. I should mention this may be a result, or rather the product of a kind of shortening of the text that happens during the Arabic translation. So it's quite possible that we don't even have the full chronicle here, that this is sort of a shortened version presented by the Arabic author. I don't know if this adequately addresses Philip Abbott's question. I apologize for that.
No. And actually, you know, you kind of opened up this area that I'm really interested in here. It seems to me that the idea of like law seems to play a really huge role in this narrative. On one hand, John accuses Diocletian of being lawless. On the other hand, you just mentioned an individual was prosecuted for casting spells. And could you tell me a little bit about the sources of law that had existed at that time, both maybe in, like of the empire, but also of Egypt at the time? and kind of how that interplay was, or what it was.
Right. So I think particularly for John by this point in the 7th century, and I can really only speak to the text, right, because that's all we have of him in his life. It seems by this point he sort of conflated in his mind sort of secular law as might be represented by the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, and ecclesiastical law. I get a sense that to him, I get a sense that to him these are sort of one and the same legal world in his mind. And so very often you find roles for people like judges, right? So judges are mentioned frequently throughout the text, but very often as well you get instances where legal matters are settled by bishops, or sometimes even by monks. So again, I don't know if that quite answers the question that you posed. But.
No, and just continuing on, Tina Shepherdson did have a question. Did you say, and if not, could you, something about how the representation of Diocletian's extra-legal seizures speaks to John's specific later context? Does it? Do you see his representing and judging Diocletian in this way because John wants to speak to John's own context?
Yeah, I think it largely fits into a pattern that I see, that the violation of legal norms for John of Nikiu, and not just for Diocletian, but for later later kings that he talks about as well, represents in some way some sort of fundamental violation of what the role of a sovereign ought to be. And so very often you'll find in the text that when the king, or when a king, or sorry, really when an emperor, I call it a king because it's nugus in the text, when an emperor, sort of violates the law or does something extra legally, or say passes a law, or calls together a council that John deems in some way illegal or heretical, or believes that it's done in an illegal way, there's sort of immediate divine punishment for this. And so what happens is the punishment isn't only enacted on the sovereign, right? The sovereign will suffer bodily diseases, sort of mental disorders, but the healthy functioning of the state deteriorates as well. So in a lot of ways, John of Nikiu's text is sort of this very pessimistic story about how a series of emperors who violate, both legal norms and sort of ethical norms gradually bring the empire to ruin. But what I really like about the text is that there's no sense that this is the end of days, right? This isn't apocalypse to John. There's some sort of like, and this may be me reading too much into this text, but there's some sort of tacit understanding that Arab hegemony isn't forever. That eventually the Romans are going to return if they, reject Chalcedon, right? And this is what a Miaphysite would want. But there seems to be some tacit understanding that as soon as John of Nikiu rejects Chalcedon, or sorry, as soon as Roman emperors reject Chalcedon, that Egypt will return to Roman hegemony, and that he himself will become a Roman citizen, and that they'll all become members of this Christian state once more. It's not the sort of the Arabs herald the end of days kind of apocalypse that you might find later on in Coptic literature. Anyway, I hope that answers Tina's question.
Yeah, and so we're going to take another audience question here. Is does the chronicle draw on any martyrological literature?
Yeah. So in particular, the Antioch legend is the example that I found most interesting. What I like though is that there seem to be hints of martyrologies that don't survive and that aren't even anti-Chalcedonian ones. So very often. And I do this as well, sort of almost by default at this point. The Chronicle of John of Nikiu writes at the end, all of this came to pass, writing about the Arab invasion of Egypt. All of this came to pass because the emperors accepted Chalcedon, right? But what I find really interesting is that in the actual body of the text, so not the end, but like right before we get to the actual Arab conquest, we're told that the actual reason that the Arabs arrive is that the Chalcedonian patriarch Cyrus kills Gaianites. So Gaianites are a sort of splinter sect of the Miaphysites. So when Severus flees to Alexandria, he does so in the company of this I guess friend of his, for lack of a better word, a comrade maybe, Gaianos. And Gaianos basically takes up a stance of Aphtharto-Doceticism, which is very complicated but not directly relevant. The point here is that these Aphtharto-Docetists, Julian Gaianites, actually end up staying in Egypt, sort of well into the conquest period. We have evidence for them going into, I think, the 8th century. But I sort of find it interesting that John seems to accidentally have, or at least, it's entirely possible as well that a later Arabic writer sort of inserted this. But there seem to be two reasons, right, for the Arab conquest. One is, rejecting Chalcedon, but the other, sort of real inciting incident seems to be Cyrus killing these Gaianite martyrs, who are explicitly referred to as such, as sort of martyrs. And I like these little episodes that we get almost by accident, where we have things like heretical martyrs. So that might be one instance of martyrological literature that we don't have, that basically only survives as brief mentions in the Chronicle of John of Nikiu.
Okay. And just kind of pushing down this vein of thought a little bit further, is there any more important information about early Islam in this text that we can take away?
Yeah, so it is, in fact, like I think most detailed narrative. It's the earliest narrative of the Arab conquest of Egypt. And I think it is perhaps, sort of one of the most detailed non-Muslim sources on the Arab conquest. What I find sort of odd about this account, and I feel sort of weird saying this because this is going to be recorded, but I want to take a risk with this. I suspect at times that the Arab conquest narrative was added by someone else. It doesn't feel like I'm reading the same guy. All of a sudden we're getting, very narrow, like prosopographical details of, sort of obscure Roman generals. All of a sudden we're getting detailed descriptions of the movement of troops, how the Muslims treat, particular people in particular towns. And this is the sort of detail that we don't see anywhere else in the Chronicle. You get this sort of sense reading the Ge'ez that you're like, it's almost as though, we had a sort of mangled discussion of the reign of Heraclius, and then all of a sudden we're talking about not even about the first Arab expansions into Syria or the collapse of the Sasanian state. We don't even get a mention of the Sasanian occupation of Egypt, which I find particularly odd, right? Like, this is something as an Egyptian you might want to mention. And all of a sudden we're just diving into this very detailed account of the Arab conquest of Egypt. I find it sort of odd, especially as well, we have the Muslims themselves explicitly described by this Christian author, both as Ishmaelites and as Muslims. And that strikes me as something that either the Arabic translator decided to add, or perhaps even an indication that this is another source that was sort of tacked on to the Chronicle. This is pure speculation on my part. Like, I have to be clear about that.
Yeah, I just kind of want to run with that for just a little bit more. So in kind of looking at that, are you looking at it from only a narrative perspective, or I know given the transmission of this manuscript, a philological analysis of it would be significantly more difficult. But do you see a philological difference as well whenever you're looking at the text?
Yeah, I have to be honest. Yeah, the philological difference is sort of difficult for me to know. But yes, no, absolutely. Well, no, I guess because of the nature of the narrative, the set of vocabulary used does change, but I can't ascribe that strictly to something that happens because of a separate author. This is sort of something I want to explore more and that I should explore more. I just worried it may be a dead end because any sort of changes could be attributed to a number of factors.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for what it's worth, in the Arab conquest narrative, we do start to get weird things like the introduction of words like vizier and this Arabic word for salary that's given. If that helps any. This is where we see the greatest sort of intrusion of Arabic words, and also glosses of Arabic words in the classical Ethiopic. So where the points at which the Ge'ez author has to pause and explain, this word means in Arabic, the one example, and I can't remember the actual word, but the one example that sticks out in my mind is he has to explain that this particular word refers to a garden of roses. And I wish I could remember the precise sort of context or the word itself, but things like this sort of come up.
Yeah. And so now, since we're talking about kind of manuscript transmission, would you mind, for my sake, because it's actually such a crazy transmission, would you mind resketching the transmission of this manuscript? And could you also tell us, where it exists today? If I wanted to go see a piece of it, where could I go? And maybe, are there multiple manuscripts? Is it just one? Just a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first, before I say anything else, Daria Alagina wrote her dissertation at the University of Hamburg. she is a Guz philologist. So she's done, to my mind, her dissertation is the sort of masterwork on the history of the Ethiopian manuscripts in that tradition of transmission. So it begins, with the Coptic text that's subsequently translated into Arabic, we think perhaps around the 13th century. And then finally, I believe the process of translation starts in 1596 and ends in 1602. And then from then on, we don't have the sort of original, I guess, manuscript. We have two texts at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. We had two at the British Library. And I believe one of those was actually the one that was returned to the Emperor Johannes in the late 19th century. So now we just have the British manuscript OR 818. Finally, I believe there's one among the sort of microfilm collection of the HMML. That was recently discovered by Daria Lajina and Jeremy Brown, who's, I believe, I don't know if he's still a graduate student, but is or was a graduate student at the Catholic University of America. And finally, there is actually a 19th century, I believe it's early 20th century Amharic translation. So this is a modern Ethiopian language. An Amharic translation of the Ge'ez translation of the Chronicle that was actually done for an Italian philologist on an exercise book. And I believe that's in Rome. So this is sort of the weird collection, the motley collection of manuscripts. The oldest ones, I believe, are the ones at the BNF.
Wow. Yeah, I'm really glad that I asked again, because that's a crazy process.
It's a strange transmission history. That's why I like it, honestly.
Yeah, it is. And we're just at the last few minutes, and I did want to give you a moment to kind of expand. At the beginning of your lecture, you'd mentioned that there was a history about John that you wanted to speak about and that could be raised. And if you still wanted to talk about it,
sorry. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt there.
No.
I was just gonna. There's was it the notion of post-Romans? I mean, this is the sort of main thing that I'm working on now. I at the end of this dissertation project, I actually during my sort of meeting with my dissertation committee, sort of expanded a bit on this idea of post-Romans, and I imagine that there are other authors as well who might find themselves in a similar position to John of Nikiu. I'm thinking in particular of intellectuals who were trained to reproduce certain cultural and political institutions, who find that there are no more institutions to produce, but nevertheless they have this training. And so I'd like to see if I can apply, the sort of things I noticed with John's memory of Rome to authors such as Fernegarius or the author of the Chronicle of Zuknin. So that's where I'd like to take this project moving forward. As much as I love John of Nikiu, I think focusing just on the one text will drive me insane.
Yeah. That's phenomenal. Well, that brings us right to the end of our time together. So I wanted to kind of take a moment and say thank you so much for coming out and joining us. I know it's later for you than in California, so thank you so much for spending your evening with us. And yeah, I'm excited to see the direction that your project takes. It sounds really amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, and thank you to the audience as well for sitting through that. There's a lot of rambling on my part. I see one raised hand. Oh, we may be out of time though. Sorry.
Yeah, and if we didn't get it to any questions, would you be all right with individuals emailing you a question?
Yeah. If you want to share my email, I mean, absolutely, that would be.
Yeah, sure.
Or I can put it in the chat. Like I don't know which way is best.
We'll put it in the chat now. And yeah, that'll be awesome.
Cool. Done.
Perfect. Okay.
Right.
Thank you so
very much. All right. Cheers. Yeah, and thank you for all the logistics work you put in as well. It was fantastic.
No problem. Not a problem at all. Thanks so much.
I look forward to seeing you in person soon, one day.
Yes, soon, one day.
All right. See you.